Hello everyone, my name is Mrs. K. If my voice is not familiar to you or my irritating northern Midwestern accent is not familiar to you, that means you normally have Mrs. Foy teaching you. I teach at Heron High School, so if my voice is familiar to you, hello, welcome back, welcome all and everyone. Today we're going to be going over 9-3 types of selection and evolutionary forces. So this is for A Day, April 13th, a Monday, or B Day, April 14th, a Tuesday. So if these are not the correct dates, maybe look for a different video or check the haiku to make sure it's all right, but that's what we're going over today. For today's objectives, we're going to describe the modern scientific theory on how life began on Earth. We'll also identify specific milestones in species evolution and the conditions that led to the changes of those species. We'll also explain the characteristic of an entire species that can change over time and how new species are formed. So here's a little bit of a friendly reminder. During these lectures, you should be taking notes. So again, just kind of think of this as if we were in class. You'd have a bell work video or something to do with bell work, and then you'd have notes. Unfortunately, we don't have guided notes to physically give you to fill in, but because of how videos work, you can pause the videos whenever you need to take as long as you need to write the notes. So we will be having a quiz at the end of this unit around the end of April, and that quiz is likely going to be timed, so you won't have time to go back through all the videos to find the specific answer, but with studying and good note-taking, you might be able to go through your notes for some of the answers for a few bits of information you've not memorized. So again, it's very important to be kind of taking notes, at least at the very, very, very bare minimum, making sure you're writing down the vocab words and very important things that are screaming to you within these. I'm going to place a double asterisk in front of bullets that do not need to be written down but are still good information to be heard. So hopefully that'll save you a little bit of time in note-taking as well. How this video is going to be set up is I'm going to be going through the lecture notes. There's going to be built-in check for understanding questions throughout the lecture. And then I'm going to have a big chunk of questions at the end of this video that would serve as your IP. So again, as a normal class, we would typically have some kind of bell work, our lecture note activity, and then you would take home an IP. So I'm going to have a big chunk of questions at the end for our IP. So a long time ago, the Earth formed. Geological evidence suggests that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Right before we went to e-learning, we had our 9.1 or 9-1 lesson, and we kind of talked briefly about how old the Earth is, as well as various different belief systems and how old they think the Earth is. But as far as geological evidence suggests, it is 4.6 billion years old. The first life forms did not appear until about 700 million years ago, and before that point, the early Earth, the atmosphere consisted of gases that could not sustain life. So there was no oxygen, it was mostly just carbon dioxide and nitrogen, but water was still present, and having water present allowed for the formation of life later. And we'll learn that that formation of the first types of life ended up creating oxygen and changing the composition of gases in the atmosphere to allow for more species. So how do we know the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, and how do we know what kinds of species lived on this planet? And that's because when an organism dies, if the conditions are just right, remains can be fossilized and preserved for millions of years. I made this joke in a few of my classes. One of the worst parts of being an adult is that nobody asks you what your favorite dinosaur is. But we wouldn't have a childhood or adulthood favorite dinosaur if it weren't for fossil records and the ability to see these awesome ancient creatures in museums. There are two major ways to determine dates and ages of specimens. The first one is relative dating, and relative dating is the age determined by a layer of rock that the fossil was found in. So if you were to go and dig in your backyard right now and dig a few inches down and find a bird skeleton, you could probably think with some pretty good information that that bird skeleton probably hasn't been there that long. But if you were to dig really deep and run into something that looked like a dinosaur bone, because of the depth that you dug, you can determine that that dinosaur or the bone that you're finding is older than the bird that you found really close to the surface. Then there's radioactive dating. Radioactive elements in a specimen, so there's little chemical tracers in our bones, in our flesh, in our materials, and those little tracers decay in a particular rate, and so we can measure how much of a substance is present to determine its age. Here are some visuals on relative versus radioactive dating. The top image showing relative dating, the lower the level, the older the specimen. So you could see that in these mountain edges, perhaps in the Grand Canyon, you're seeing various types of sea life fossils found throughout it. And the fossils found at the top are the most recent, and the ones found at the bottom are the oldest. Then there's radioactive dating. So this is a table that shows how the radioactive markers decay the older the specimen is. So because of the rate of decaying, we could determine the age of the specimen. So it is believed that life evolved from a small organic particles, which eventually created the first single-celled organisms. Those first single-celled organisms evolved amongst themselves. Remember that tree of life that I might have showed you on the first day of 9-1 lesson, where we had a bacterial cell, and that bacterial cell formed into archaeobacteria, and archaeobacteria evolved into a eukaryote, our first types of cells with nucleuses, and those eukaryotes eventually evolved into multicellular organisms, which eventually changed and evolved into all the species that we know have existed today. So again, bacteria are thought to be the first organisms on the planet. Then other autotrophs evolved. Remember, autotrophs are things that can self-make their own food. Autotrophs being photosynthesizers. They take in gas and sun and water and produce sugar for themselves and then oxygen as a waste product. So after millions of years, autotrophs created enough oxygen to allow the evolution of species that needed oxygen and could not make their own energy. So life finds a way. Kind of heard this quote here or there, especially if you're a fan of Jurassic Park. But throughout time, events have happened to change the environment, which guides how species evolve. So environmental pressures mixed with some natural selection causes species to change over time. So an example would be at the end of the Jurassic period, there is believed to be an ice age caused by an asteroid striking the Earth. So what happened is this asteroid caused massive, in theory, and evidence is starting to point more and more to this. The asteroid caused massive tectonic plates to move when it impacted. And because the impact caused the tectonic plates to move, that caused volcanoes to erupt. And when volcanoes erupt, they put a lot of gas and a lot of ash into the atmosphere. Those kinds of gases and ashes blocked the sun, which ended up dropping the temperature of the planet. Remember, dinosaurs are basically like reptiles, and reptiles need sun and warm temperatures in order to maintain their body temperature and live. So because the ash blocked the sun and also dropped the temperature of the planet, this resulted in an ice age. Because the dinosaurs were not able to maintain their temperatures and stay warm, and the types of vegetation on the planet was not able to grow because the sun was blocked, This caused a mass extinction event, a widespread and rapid decrease in biodiversity on Earth. So we had extinctions of various types of plants, we had extinctions of various types of dinosaurs and other kinds of living organisms on the planet. However, the few organisms that were able to survive and adapt did so because of their ability to adapt to the new conditions. They were able to move to somewhere better, or they were able to have some sort of trait that allowed them to survive the conditions. So there's quite a few ways that species change. In the last lesson, we had the history of evolution, and we talked about natural selection. So here's a little bit of a refresher on that. So natural selection was coined by Charles Darwin, and natural selection is a big contributor to the theory of evolution. So a refresher on the term natural selection, it's a process by which organisms with variable traits survive longer and reproduce more. An individual that has high fitness is more suited for its environment. Okay, and there are several ways natural selection works, and we're kind of going to dig into that a little bit more here today. So several modes of natural selection. There is directional selection, stabilizing selection, sexual selection, and artificial selection. The next few slides are going to go into these types of selection in more detail. So, of the modes of selection, the first one is directional selection, a favored trait that is at one extreme end of a trait spectrum. So an example of this is peppered moths. Peppered moths are a type of moth species that have a range of colorations between white to medium colored because it's got some speckles or pepper flakes on it, to very dark with a lot of pepper flakes on it. So moths are just like humans, and as humans have a broad spectrum of skin colors in their genes, so do the moths. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the majority of the moths in that area were light to medium toned. And they were light to medium toned because those colorations blended in with the very light trees. The trees in that area were like our birch trees here, so very light bark tones. So because the light to medium tones blended in with the light trees, the birds were easily able to eat the darker toned individuals. Okay. After the Industrial Revolution and during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of pollution that came about. So a lot of soot, a lot of ash, a lot of dirt and other industrial wastes caused the trees to become a lot darker. So the soot and the dirt stuck to the trees, making them go from a nice light color to a dark and dirty color. Because of that, the darker toned moths were able to hide and survive and were favored as far as fitness goes from the birds. The birds were able to now see the lighter individuals, and because the birds were able to see the lighter individuals, the darker colors became more successful, leading to the majority of the population over time to turn dark. So because the darker individuals were able to hide easier from the birds, they were able to reproduce and have babies, which then led them to, over time become darker. Another type of selection is stabilizing selection. So this selects against extreme genotypes and selects the majority that are well adapted to the environment. So an example of this is baby weight at birth. Before things like cesarean or C-sections, women had to give birth naturally. Okay, so studies found that babies that were born very small struggled to survive. Alternatively, babies that were very large may have caused natural labor issues for the mother and for baby, and therefore their survival rate was also low. However, medium-sized babies tended to survive the most because they were large enough to, have the nutrition and energy to continue growing, but yet they were small enough to be born more easily and avoid complications during labor. So the third mode of selection is sexual selection. There are two kinds of sexual selection, one being male competition and the other being female choice. With male competition, this is intimidation through features or actual fighting. So an example of this could be the images to the left. We have two bull moose, bull meaning male. The moose on the top has a very big rack of antlers, and the moose on the bottom does not. So because the moose on the top has the big rack of antlers, he is able to send intimidation signals to younger or smaller males that says, look, I'm big, I'm healthy, I probably have better fighting ability or knowledge, stay away from my females. Okay, so that male is able to outcompete other males just by intimidation. Then, if the males have about the same size rack, then they would do actual fighting, where, you know, the biggest and strongest male would ultimately end up winning. But if you can avoid fighting, you might as well try, right? Then there's female choice. So this is where the males competing with each other doesn't really matter. The female gets to pick whichever male they think will have the best babies or the most successful babies with them. So this involves males having traits that make themselves more fit or appear more fit to females. So an example of this is peacocks. So because peacocks are a species, they have variation within that species. Some males are drab. Some males have colorful but small feathers. Some males have colorful and large and beautiful feathers, creating a big pretty fan. Okay. So in the female small tiny peacock brain, she's thinking, well, I don't want a drab looking male. I think I want the big male with the big colorful fan, because that means he's been able to run away from predators and outcompete other males. Him having this big impressive feature must mean he is more fit and would give me better offspring. Okay, so that is the female choice of sexual selection. This is actually kind of bad for peacocks overall, though, because over time we've now noticed that the peacocks with the bigger fans have been selected for, leading their babies to have bigger fans and more colorful fans. But at this point, the fans are becoming so big they're almost burdensome. So it can kind of be not great for species overall, but the logic makes sense there initially. The last mode of selection is artificial selection. So this is where human interference encourages selections of some traits and discourages others. So this is how we went from a wild animal similar to the gray wolf and turned it into Chihuahuas, pugs, German shepherds. We took traits that we liked, like friendliness or herding ability or ability to hunt rats, and we turned them into specific dog types, okay? Even though, you know, we still question, why do pugs exist? They can't really breathe, they can't go to the bathroom correctly, but I guess some people think they're cute, so that's why they're there. But artificial selection can also be applied for like plants. So to the left we see that there is a common wild mustard. It's just a European wild weed, and we were able to select certain traits of that wild weed and turn it into things that we know today as kale, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and whatever kohlrabi is. Okay, so we were able to take something that was just a plain boring weed and turn it into things that we want to eat. So beyond natural selection, there are several ways that species can change over time. During our 9-1 lesson, we kind of talked about macro and micro evolution. Again, here's macro evolution, which is kind of the big evolution. It's the evolution of new species and the die-off of others. So when entire species or populations change in response to their environmental pressures. There are 5 ways in which these species can change over time. One being extinction, second being divergent evolution, third being convergent evolution, and then coevolution. Kind of think of what those prefixes mean as we talk about them on the next slide. So the first major way that species can change over time is extinction. So extinction is the end of a species. So the species no longer exists on the planet. So causes of extinction can include mass extinction events, kind of like the asteroid, or ice ages, things like that. Targeted environmental changes, lack of genetic variation. So if you had a large population of a species, but that species dropped in population and now there's only like 20 left, those individuals will need to basically inbreed with each other over and over and over again, reducing the genetic variation and increasing the amount of inbreeding issues we see. Then there's the inability to adapt or migrate. So in the example of polar bears, with the climate changing and the global temperature rising, the polar bears are unable to adapt or migrate. So they're just now kind of stuck in an area where there's not enough ice to find the seals that they need to live and thrive. And because of that, we're now seeing that the average body average body weight of polar bears is now significantly lower than it used to be, and because their body weight is lower and they don't have as much fat and energy, they're now having less cubs than they used to as well. Then there's divergent evolution. So while species can change, not all populations may respond in the same way. So divergent kind of like means dividing. So when different populations of the same species evolve over time in different ways and respond to different pressures. So if you look at the image below, there was some kind of ancestral mammal, and because of that ancestral mammal moving around into different regions and different environments, there were different stressors put on that mammal that caused it to evolve and change over time into many different species. So it caused it to divide up and evolve into camels, dolphins, rhinos, elephants, all from the same ancestral mammal. So as populations become more and more different, they reach a point in which they are no longer the same species or speciation. Okay, so that's where you run into things where like there was an ancient hoofed mammal, and because that hoofed mammal roamed to different continents and different areas, and one ended up in a desert and one ended up in a jungle and one ended up in a mountain range, we ended up with, impalas and goats and horses. So that caused that ancient hoofed mammal to turn into different species based on the different environmental needs. Now we have convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is when organisms are not closely related to each other, have similar characteristics. Okay, so bats are not closely related to birds or bees, and bees are not closely related to birds or bats either. All right, so this is kind of like referring to what we learned last lesson with homologous anatomy and analogous anatomy. Homologous anatomy is where you have a common ancestor, and because of that you have a lot of the same features, traits, and functions. Analogous is where you have similar functioning things like wings, but you're not closely related. So this is dealing with convergent evolution. So bees, not closely related to birds, still have wings because they needed the functionality of being able to fly. So through natural selection and random mutations, bees were able to adapt to flying just like birds were, even though they don't have a common ancestor. So again, due to similar characteristics and circumstances and need for the specific function or job, unrelated organisms can become more and more alike. So lastly, there is coevolution. Coevolution is when there are two species that rely on each other to be successful. So when one species in the relationship evolves or changes, you'll often see that the other species also evolves or changes to keep up with the relationship that leads them to both be successful over time. Okay, so organisms with relationships with other species, this is basically the definition of ecology. Ecology is organisms interacting with each other and their environment. So both species in this situation continue to benefit as they evolve with each other. So the pace at which organisms evolve is determined by different environmental factors as well as other pressures. So I want to give a little reminder here that individuals do not evolve. Okay, Individuals cannot make big changes to themselves, which then will be passed on to their offspring and then cause, the future generations to have those changes. You don't see bodybuilders having babies born with abs, okay? Things evolve by population slowly changing over time, and the things that are, naturally selected for with random mutations that are beneficial get passed on, and that slowly causes evolution and speciation. So gradualism is a slow and steady change over time within a population. Again, it's not an individual. So just one ancient ancestor slowly changing and adapting to their environment until we see what we see as a species today. Then there's also punctuated equilibrium, which is when there's long periods of stability and slow changes over time, but then something caused the environment to drastically change, and then therefore it causes a rapid change in speciation or evolution. So this slide again goes over the objectives that we talked about today, just as a reminder, which then now starts our individual practice portion of today's Ed Puzzle. So the following questions are going to count as your IP for today. So if you have any questions on anything that we talked about today, or if you want to learn some extra information, please feel free to email me or Mrs. Foy, as well as if you would like, you could check in on our office hours, which are posted on our haiku. All right, have a good rest of your evening, and I hope the weather is nice today and you get to go outside for a bit. All right, see ya. Bye.